Changemakers, what's up? Welcome to the Change Chats podcast. I'm your host, Tiesha, and here we're all about addressing various topics in life because we can't change what we won't confront. So let's talk about it. Changemakers, what's up? Thank you for joining me for episode 2 of season 1 of the Change Chats podcast. If you have not already, please stop what you're doing right now and go back and watch episode 1, which is all about just doing it, answering the call of God. Now, if you know me, you know that I'm not one to prolong. So we are going to get right into today's topic, but I want you to stop. Take a deep breath with me. Inhale. Because listen, baby, we are going to get into some things today. So buckle up and get ready for the ride. Today, we will be talking about triumphs, triggers, and trauma. This is part 1 or episode 1 of a multi-episode topic, triumphs, triggers, and trauma. It's so necessary, something that we need to address on so many levels. And I knew that I wouldn't be able to do it with just one episode. On the next couple of episodes, we are actually going to have some special guests. So make sure that you come back after this. And I believe that once this episode is finished, as we near the end, you'll be ready for the episodes to come anyway. So just stay tuned for that. Today's episode will focus specifically on childhood trauma, our trauma responses, those types of things. We'll get more into what that looks like, more into the triggers and the triumphs in the following episodes. Why did I choose the topic of triumphs, triggers, and trauma? I want to share with you a quote that I found. It says, "Trauma is perhaps the most avoided, ignored, belittled, denied, misunderstood, and untreated cause of human suffering." I want to read that one more time. Trauma is perhaps the most avoided, ignored, belittled, denied, misunderstood, and untreated cause of human suffering. That is a quote by Peter Levine. And so the reason, or Levine, I don't know which one, but the reason that I decided to do this episode today is after I'm following the Just Do It episode, Answering the Call of God, I realized that so many of us are suffering from things that we have not checked. And it becomes difficult for us to fully walk in the call of God, to trust God if we are not aware of our sufferings and where they stem from. So I decided to start this next episode with this topic in the hopes that it'll help us walk into the calling of God over our lives. I wanted to make those of us who are not aware that we are actually suffering from childhood trauma to first make us aware and then begin to take the steps to change whatever we may be living in as the result of our trauma. But then also, many of us have children or desire to have children, and it is so important that we do not perpetuate a trauma cycle, that because we have unchecked trauma, because we have triggers and our trauma responses cause us to then pass down trauma to our children. That's something that I'm trying to be more aware of, more cognizant of, and to change, to confront and change, and something that I think that we all should address and move in a direction of changing for the sake of our children. And then also our human interactions. Day to day, we have to interact with people, whether it's on the job, with our spouses, our children, our family members, whomever it may be with, we have to interact with other people. And so many of us have been exposed to traumatic situations that it's important that even if we don't have a history that is plagued by trauma, that we know what some of the signs and symptoms look like, and that we know how prevalent trauma is in the lives of other people so that we can better engage and interact with people. So what exactly is trauma? I have some formal definitions, and then I want to actually share what my interpretation of trauma is. The first definition is experiences that cause intense physical and psychological stress reactions. That definition comes from the National Institute of Health. The second definition is an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, rape, or a natural disaster. That comes from the American Psychological Association. And then the last definition, in my own words, is an instance or occurrence that invokes a sort of scared response in us. It's something that is that we perceive as painful or dangerous and that makes us afraid. That type of situation or event that occurs. And I wanted to note that the formal definitions that I gave, the first one says that it's an experience. And then the second definition says that it is an emotional response. Two different definitions that is one situational and one that is determined by our response. And I wanted to give those two different definitions to say that trauma is so big. If we go back to that quote that I just said, where it says that it's perhaps the most avoided, ignored, belittled, denied, misunderstood, and untreated cause of human suffering. So I said that to say that trauma in and of itself can be subtle yet complex. It can be an experience, but it can also be an emotional response. It's such a deep type of thing that it is so important for us to know and be aware that it can show up in many forms and fashions so that we can then check and change it. Most of us at some point have experienced some type of trauma, whether it's an isolated event that we'll kind of get into, or whether it has been multiple events, multiple experiences that we've had that have been traumatic. There are three different types of traumas that I found in my research. The first one is acute trauma, which, as I spoke about, is an isolated event or experience. So this may be, to give some examples, maybe you had a really bad car accident. Maybe you were raped or molested. Maybe you saw something that happened to somebody else that was really traumatic. You experienced the loss of someone that you really loved. It can vary as far as the type of event, but it's usually an isolated event that was extremely traumatic and that has stuck with you. The next type of trauma is chronic trauma. Now, this is typically a series or repeated exposure to an event. And this is usually one type of event, but it's just over an extended period of time. So this may be that someone has been repeatedly molested or raped or abused or whatever the trauma is. And I know that I'm sticking with a certain type of trauma, but whatever that thing is that comes up for you that may have happened over a period of time, but it's a specific type of trauma. And then the last type of trauma is complex trauma. And this is exposure to varied and multiple dangerous, painful, scary situations over a period of time. So maybe over the years you've experienced neglect, domestic violence. You've seen somebody you love be abused. You grew up in a neighborhood where it was extremely violent and you were exposed to a bunch of different types of situations. This is prolonged exposure to multiple types of devastation, if you will. And what this complex trauma usually does is leaves a residual impact that causes a person to feel like they're actually still experiencing and exposed to that thing even after they've been removed from the traumas. So oftentimes we hear about post-traumatic stress disorder. That's usually associated to someone who was in the service, like the army, the military, or who has been through something extremely traumatic from what we think trauma is. But many of us in our regular lives have experienced complex trauma that has caused post-traumatic stress disorder or caused us to feel like we're still living in that experience. It is a psychological implication that is left as a result of that trauma that makes us feel like we're still in it in real life. When I was preparing for this episode, or this topic, I should say, something in me told me that I needed to go back and revisit my old neighborhood, the first neighborhood that I remember growing up in. My dad would argue that I was born into another house in the same neighborhood, but I only remember coming up in this first house on Braille Street. And so I decided to go back and revisit that neighborhood, because when I decided to talk about this topic and introduce it on this podcast, I'm not the type of person who just wants to gloss over things, but I want to heal myself. I want to address things myself. I don't want to just tell you all that it's important to confront things to change them, but I actually want to show the fruit and the evidence that I'm doing the same thing. Not that I've arrived. In some ways I've healed from some things, but there's also some things that I still need to confront. And so this was one of those things. I decided to go back to my old neighborhood, revisit my old house and my old school, as to better engage in this topic in order to help you all in your healing processes. Or processes, I should say. So you can go ahead and watch the next clip that's going to roll. Oh, I am starting to remember some of these houses. Oh my gosh. door is open, so I ain't trying to scare nobody, but that's my old house. And there's a dog sitting right out there, so I can't go, oh man, I can't go too far into that, but my old neighborhood. I'm gonna turn back around and show y'all. My old block, and it's coming up. It's gonna be a tan house, the tan front vinyl. That's it right there. My old house, right there. Wow. Look at these houses. Oh, memories. So many memories. All right, I'm gonna try to go back down to where my old elementary school was. The first of 3 elementary schools that I attended. All right, y'all, we are approaching Kosciuszko Elementary. This was the first elementary school I attended. And the best, hands down, the best. Like, oh my gosh. I have tons of stories that I could tell, but I'm not going to right now. You gonna let me go back? Thank you. Tons of stories that I could tell. I ain't even gonna get into it right now, but oh my gosh. Look at this. So sad to see. Man, I don't even know how to explain it. It hurts to see things for what they are now when I remember what they used to be. Wow. Look at this. Circling back around. What a time. What a time to be alive. My heart. Y'all, if you watched the previous videos, you know that I just went and visited my old neighborhood, the first neighborhood I remember growing up in. My dad would probably argue that I was born into a different house, but this is that house on Braille was the first house that I remember coming up in. And I just went and drove back down that block, and what an experience it was. I wanted it to be a little bit different. I wanted to get out of the car, be able to walk at least up to the curb and have that experience again. But when I drove by, as you all saw, there was a dog in the driveway and the door was wide open. And if you know my old neighborhood, especially what's become of it now, then you know that wouldn't have been smart of me to get out the car and try to do any type of exploring, especially not with my camera. So the experience went a little bit different, but I'm still happy that I had the opportunity to go there. And when I was riding up to the house on the first block that I was on Braille, I didn't remember a lot of those houses, but as I hit my block, I started to remember some of the houses, and immediately like memories and flashbacks started to come up. And it was just like, wow, like having the experience of being there again. I've driven by the general vicinity numerous times, but I've not gone by that house in so many years. And I've looked up pictures and whatnot, but it's nothing like being there again. It was different. It was different. And then even more when I decided to drive by Kosciuszko, which was my first elementary school, that there really, I mean, I'm still trying to keep my composure from driving by there. And I know that y'all probably, I'm sorry. Woo! Woo! I didn't expect this. I'm sorry. I know that y'all probably saw by the video and my reaction. It wasn't like, I didn't expect it. I thought that if anything, I would be like this from driving by my old house. But that school, I mean, I think going back there,
it just kind of in a moment encapsulated a feeling that I've had for over a decade that I couldn't quite put into words. But now, after having matured and gone through life, I'm able to understand what I was experiencing in that moment. And then, like, immediately as I was pulling up to the school, as I was pulling up to the school, just a rush of emotion came over me. And as I started to process, I realized that it was because, you know, that was like my first experience of life. And I realized that when I was like 8 or 9 years old, my sisters and I, there was a traumatic situation that caused us to be abruptly snatched from our home and from that school. And I realized that since then, it took me a while to find home again. That was the last place where I felt like I had a sense of home. And I was 8 or 9 when I left there. And so I went over a decade and a half of feeling like I didn't belong anywhere. Like there was no place that fit me. There was no place where I fit. And it wasn't until I got with my husband and we started to create our own home and um have our children that I really feel like I have been able to now establish a home again. But imagine going over a decade of feeling like you just don't belong and going back to that place and experiencing like I didn't even get out. I can't imagine what it would have been like if I would have gotten out and stood on those grounds again. I'm even as I'm talking now, I just remember so many experiences of being there, and I won't get into it too much because I want to elaborate a bit more with my next episode on my podcast. But it it is crazy how the fabric of our being is an entanglement of the different experiences we've had in life. And though I've grown and I've overcome a lot of things and I've created a new story for myself or new chapters of the story, I can't deny that what happened and the life I lived back then directly impacted my story today. And it was just amazing being there again. It's like I felt a collision of the childhood Tiasha and the adult Tiasha and the many complexities of our experience, of our human experience. I felt in just a matter of minutes in driving around there. So, I mean, I don't even know. I don't want to sit here and go off on a tangent too much, but I needed that. And I feel like I even need to go back and get out. And one day, I believe I will. But I needed that. I needed that for so many reasons. And all I can tell y'all is to stay tuned for episode 2 of the Change Chat podcast, where we'll be talking about triumphs, triggers, and trauma.
Going back, that was such a moment. And I know that it was a brief little drive by, a brief experience, but it brought up so much in me that I did not anticipate. And I realized that revisiting my old neighborhood was a trigger for me. And I did not realize until I went back to my neighborhood that it was a trigger and that it was possible for us to be triggered in both positive and negative ways. I'll get into the triggers a little bit more, like I said, in the upcoming episodes, but I just wanted to note that going back to that place brought up something in me that reminded me that it was both the birthing place and the burial site of my innocence. And when I say innocence, I don't mean just, it wasn't necessarily, when we think of our innocence, we think of like our virginity and when somebody is raped or molested and it's a stripping away of their innocence. I'm not talking about that because that didn't happen in that environment. But that environment was the birthing place and the burial site of my innocence because it was a place in which I was exposed to things for the first time in a good way, but then in that same breath, they were stripped away from me. As I said, when I went back and you saw that video, it stripped away, it introduced me in one breath choose my ability to be a child, but in that very same breath stripped away that ability. And it stripped away my ability to grow up and process like a child. And instead, because of the things that I was exposed to and the trauma that I witnessed, I had to grow up in a place of anxiety and worry and looking over my shoulder or trying to think ahead of what life would be like. My traumas essentially caused me to be in this state of constant survival. I felt like I had to always know what was coming or be on guard, and I never got to live in a place of relaxation and rest because I was exposed to so much constant trauma that I felt like my way of life was a way of survival, that I always had to be on pins and needles and figure out how it was that I would survive the situations that I was exposed to. And when I was looking up and researching this whole idea of childhood trauma, there were a number of different studies that I found that talked about childhood trauma being from the time that we're born into the time that we're like 6 or 8. I saw another article that talked about childhood trauma being from 0 to 18, but most of what I saw was that childhood trauma makes the most formidable impression from the ages of 0 to 6 or 0 to 8, and that is the time where we are most impressionable and where things stick with us the most, and it becomes more difficult after those ages to reverse the perception that we gain in those ages from the trauma that we experience. And so what I want to do, y'all, and I'm not gonna lie, I got some Kleenex with me. This is my kids' Kleenex. I got some Kleenex because you just never know when we're talking about trauma and triggers and all those types of things, and even reliving or rethinking about the ways in which we've overcome and triumphed over those situations. I don't always know the type of emotional response that's going to happen. So I brought the Kleenex just in case. But I want to actually pull out the book that I wrote. This is the first book that I wrote and published in 2018. I was writing this book for 5 years, and it is my life's memoir. It's called From Badly Broken to Beautifully Mended, and it touches heavily on some of the traumas that I experienced from childhood on up. But I want to read a small excerpt here to give you all an idea of some of the trauma that I have experienced, which will fall into the category of complex trauma, which is varied in multiple traumas. But this particular instance I want to share with you. Apart from what took place inside the house, the picture on my screen also served as a reminder of the memories made outside. It was there on Braille Street during the scorching summer days that my sisters and I had the most fun of our lives. We went from having huge fights on our lawn amongst all the neighborhood children to getting wet in those same sprinklers with those same kids on that same lawn. Occasionally, the fire hydrant will be turned on and kids from all over the neighborhood would come and dance and play in the water. It was almost like our little piece of heaven where, along with some of the good times we had in the house, my sisters and I learned to put out the fires of life that were so often caused by our parents. Sometimes it seems that as soon as we put out one fire, another would arise more vicious than the one we'd previously conquered. Still, my sisters and I tried to make the best of the worst situations. I can remember times when we came home to the place I loved so much, only to find that we had no electricity, no heat, or no water. One day in the middle of spring, our water was shut off. My sister Chastity, who is 2 years older than me, around 9 or 10 at the time, decided she was going to steal water from our next door neighbors. I can't quite remember if Chastity wanted the water to make herself ramen noodles or to bathe. Whatever the case, if she wanted something badly enough, she would get it. Chastity took an empty milk jug that we had stored in the kitchen and made her way to the front door. One thing about Chastity is that she was and still is, as many would suggest, sassy. She moved to her own beat at her own pace most of the time. As her chubby feet hit the pavement, she nonchalantly walked to the side of our neighbor's house, where she turned on the rusted bronze colored handle that was connected to the bricked side. Before we knew it, water began freely streaming from the house to the jug. It seemed as if it were taking forever for the jug to fill, which I later concluded was because I was extremely nervous, knowing it was possible that at any moment Chastity could have been caught red-handed. The process ended, and Chastity made her way back to our house with the scowled look of disgrace, though this was no rarity. So I wanted to share that instance because it encompassed a few different things. It talked about an isolated instance of trauma, but also so many other times in which, like I said, we had to put out fires that as children we should have been shielded and protected from, but we found ourselves having to be the heroes in the sense for ourselves and to handle situations that at our young ages we should not have had to handle. There are multiple types of trauma, but the one that I experience most is complex trauma in multiple situations in varied instances. I want to kind of go through some of the things that come from trauma and the experiences that I've had of my own that were traumatic. So I listed here some of the types of experiences that we could have that are not limited to these, but include neglect, witnessing domestic violence or being abused as children on our own, psychological or verbal abuse and manipulation. So the first instance of abuse that I was talking about is physical abuse, but we could also be psychologically or emotionally, verbally abused and manipulated. And then also instability or just not having that place of protection, feeling protected, being exposed to varied types of situations that leave a trauma response within us. So I talked about neglect, and the excerpt that I just read from my book was very much so an instance of neglect that me and my sisters experienced. I'm just going back and I'm having flashbacks right now of moments in where we had to be resourceful. If we didn't have any water, we would have to pour water down the toilet in order to be able to flush the toilet. If we did not have any lights, we would have to come together and do. And then if our heat was cut off, the certain things that we had to do, candles or coming snuggling up. Sometimes my mother would leave the oven open for certain instances if we didn't have electricity, that type of thing. So there were just a number of instances that we had to fend for ourselves and protect ourselves. Sometimes my mother would be there and she would be snuggled up with us or trying to, help us. And sometimes she wouldn't be there. Sometimes she would leave us in these situations. And it's very hard for me to talk about my experiences without feeling guilty, because me doing this is not to point the finger at my parents or to have anybody judging my parents or to say that I'm judging them or holding a grudge against them. But I can't share my experiences without sharing the parts in which I was exposed by the people who were supposed to be protecting me. So I wanted to give that disclaimer, because as I'm even addressing some of my trauma, as you all will have to address your traumas or who have had to, it becomes difficult because it seems like we're villainizing the people that we love. And I love my mother. I love my father. I love the people who were raising me or meant to protect me. But I cannot address the things that I experienced without, in a sense, exposing who exposed me to these situations. So I wanted to just give that disclaimer. We grew up in a very neglected household, neglected in the sense that we didn't have sometimes the things that we needed, but then also just neglected in the sense that we did not have the love and the protection that we needed. My sisters and I were exposed to domestic violence. My mother was in abusive relationships, so we had to witness and sometimes run to her rescue, try to help her in situations where she was being abused. And that is devastating. In moments in which we are exposed to trauma as children, as I just said, those impressionable ages where we've not even learned how to process through things. We have not even matured in our psychological state, in our mind, in our ability to even be able to process what we're experiencing. So in the time that we're supposed to be able to be children and process through like the barriers and the roadblocks of being a child alone, then there's this complex layer that's added when we have to grow up so fast and process things before our minds can actually wrap around what's happening. And so I remember being exposed to these traumas and feeling like this is not right. Like, but also like not knowing how to navigate through them, not having the help that I needed to navigate through them. And just even now, as I'm talking about these things, I have to kind of slow down and pull back, because I realize that I'm trying to navigate through them now as an adult, and there are still things that are unchecked that I never got help for. I never was able to really address in the way that I should have. So now trying to address them and navigate through them is a little bit more complex than they should be. So imagine how as a child what that does, and what that's like when we're exposed to things that we can't comprehend or understand. And in life, that's not the type of what it does to our mental state, not just our physical state, but our mental state, what it does to us as children, not being able to navigate through things that we should not have to navigate through in the first place. And then on top of like witnessing, on top of the neglect and witnessing the domestic violence, there was also the psychological, verbal, emotional component of having people, adults, tell me things like you're a child, stay in the child's place, get out of my business, what happens in my house stays in my house. But I'm knowing that this is not right, but I don't have a voice to say that this is not right. So being muffled was also another trauma in and of itself when I'm exposed to things, but I'm also talked down to and told that I can't do this, I can't say this, I'm not right, I don't get an apology, I can't be right in this situation, I'm a child, so I'm automatically wrong. Imagine what that does to a child's mental state, that psychological manipulation and abuse, and just that your child stay in the child's place. So having to navigate through witnessing with my eyes these things being neglected, then being emotionally, verbally, and psychologically abused and manipulated into thinking and believing a certain way. And I never did subscribe to what I was told was a child's place. And so now I'm the bad child. Now I'm the rebellious child because I don't subscribe to the belief that a child shouldn't have a voice. A child shouldn't be able to do this. And so now I'm behaving in a certain way. So this is why trauma is so complex, because our experiences then shape it affects us. It affects our ability to develop, right? We develop these issues with our developmental phases and stages as a child. But then it also creates attachment and detachment and trust issues, because the people who are supposed to be protecting me, loving me, helping me navigate through these things, figure things out, helping me to emotionally regulate, don't know how to help me do that. And they're all these things and factors are being thrown at me. And so now I have these trust issues, because if my mother and my father are not protecting me, if they're not helping me, if they're not affirming me, if they're not doing that, now who can I trust? Because this is what I'm born into. And that's where I say it was birth. My situation in my childhood was both the birthing place and the burial site of my innocence, because at the same time, I'm supposed to be protected. I'm supposed to be cared for. I'm supposed to be provided for as a child and able to grow up and come into certain things. But I never got the opportunity to grow up and come into certain things. That opportunity was stripped away from me because of the traumas that I was exposed to. So it creates these attachment and detachment and trust issues. It also, as I just said, creates issues with emotional regulation. I couldn't emotionally regulate because now I'm having these outbursts, or I'm coming into myself and staying detached and isolated and in this state because I don't know how to emotionally regulate. I don't know how to navigate through life. I don't know what triggers I'm going to be to my parents or to the people around me. And I don't then know how to emotionally regulate myself. I don't know how to navigate through my own emotions as I'm experiencing this life. There's no place, no space for me to figure it out, or nobody to help me figure it out. So I don't know how to emotionally regulate. Then there are these behavior issues as the result of what I'm exposed to. And then being a child, right? So I'm a child, right? Children have these behavioral issues. They do have to learn how to show up in the world around them. But then you have that, and then you have the added layer of trauma on top of that. So then it plays a role in how I'm thinking and learning and processing, reasoning and problem solving, because this aspect of trauma is introduced, and it makes the act of thinking and reasoning and processing more complex, because there's now this added layer that should never be there in the first place, that I am adding to the pot of how I think and reason. And so my reasoning may be much different from somebody else's, because I have this additional layer, or this additional factor that is now into play or into what I'm considering as I'm thinking and reasoning and trying to rationalize and make sense of life in a way that I should not have to. But it also played a role in my self-confidence and my self-perception, because you don't again have this, you don't have anyone really affirming you. You don't have anyone helping you to process and see yourself in the way that you should see yourself. You don't know how to navigate. You don't even have time to build your self-esteem and your self-confidence, because again, you're living in this constant state of survival, and this constant place of trying to figure out life and being on edge and trying to protect yourself and trying to shield yourself and trying to um, predict what's going to happen next. That it plays a role in how I view myself, how we view ourselves, and how we perceive ourselves and the world around us. Trauma also can cause us to disassociate. I don't remember a lot before the age of 6. And I think it was because before that age, there was so much trauma in my life that to protect myself and to survive, I disassociated from the situations and the traumas that I experienced. And in trying to disassociate from the traumas and the hard things and the painful things, the scary things, I also disassociated from other events and situations and memories within that time frame, which is very hard for me sometimes when I hear my sisters talking about certain experiences and certain things that I can't remember, not just because I was younger than them, but also because I've, in a sense, erased from my memory or pushed to the very back of my mind, because those good memories are entangled with the trauma and the bad memories. And so we talk about the experiences. And again, remember that your experience may be different, but it does not negate that it could have been a traumatic experience. Now I want to talk about some of the trauma responses that we often have. They can be anger, avoidance, anxiety, depression, sadness, fear, self-blame, guilt, pity. There are so many trauma responses that we can have. For me, as I spoke of before, it was the anxiety. As a child, I was very anxious, very worried, very nervous about what was to come. I was very much so of one to avoid things, to detach from people. I would be in the midst of a lot of people, but I never really allowed myself to attach to people, because I was so used to the abandonment, to the neglect, to nothing being stable. There was such an instability in my life, of my physical environment, of the people in my life, that I detached, I avoided, I isolated, I stayed away. And I was, as a result of all of these things, that is not how we're meant to function in the world. We're not meant to function from a place of trauma. And when we do, it plays on our mental state. And it did exactly that to me. And I began to live a life of depression, just deep depression. And while I never attempted or wanted to commit suicide, I did oftentimes wish that I didn't wake up, or wish that I would just died in my sleep, or something like that, that I just did not have to live the life that I was living anymore. But some of you may have experienced suicidal thoughts, or maybe even attempted to commit suicide because of the trauma that you've experienced in your life. That is a trauma response. We respond in a way based on the experiences that we've had and the effects that the experiences have made on us, the impressions that the experiences have made in us. It causes us to respond to a certain way. And so when we get into the upcoming episodes where we talk a little bit more about our triggers, sometimes we respond to our triggers by trying to figure out solutions that are not the most healthy, because our triggers make us feel uncomfortable. And so we pile all these things on top of it, because it doesn't feel good to be triggered and then have to relive those experiences again. Another response to the traumas that we often experience is this perpetual trauma influenced decision making. So remember when I talked in the opening of this episode about how I wanted to talk about this episode in part because I don't want us to perpetuate trauma-informed decision making that we're passing down to our children, and that are impacting the lives of other people that we encounter because we have not confronted the trauma that we've experienced in order to change and heal for the better. I lived a lot of my life perpetuating trauma because I didn't check it. And so because of the trauma that I experienced, I made more traumatic decisions. My decision making was induced by the trauma that I had already experienced. And we don't want that anymore. It's time for us to do better, be better, to heal. And to do that, we have to be aware. We have to talk about it. We have to address it. We have to know what it is. We have to see it for what it is. We have to be willing to be uncomfortable, to relive some things, to go back down memory lane, to pull up the things that we buried before. We have to be willing to confront those things in order to heal from those things. And so, like I said, while we're not going to be talking about triggers or triumphs as much in this episode as we will in the upcoming episodes, one way for sure that we triumph is by doing things like this, by talking about it, by addressing it, by digging and confronting the things that hurt us. That's one of the best ways for us to triumph over the trauma and the triggers that make us respond in a certain way into our adulthood. I'm going to bring it all in, bring it all home for this particular episode. And we're going to address this more, the traumas, the triggers, the triumphs in the upcoming episodes. But in the meantime, remember that this is Change Chats. And so, as I said in the first episode, there always has to be a change that comes from the chats. We just had the chat. We talked about childhood trauma. We talked about our experiences, the effects, and the responses, the trauma responses that come from our trauma. So now let's talk about the change. What happens from here? I want you to think about something in this episode that you would like to catch and keep. That's going to be a recurring thing that we do in these episodes. What did you catch, or what do you want to catch and keep from this episode? Maybe it's something that I introduced that you didn't know before that you want to look into a little bit more. Maybe it's something that I said that you're questioning, that you want to think about a little bit more. What is that thing that you caught or that you want to catch and that you want to keep, that you want to explore a bit more, that you want to carry with you, that you want to look into, dig into a little bit more? Think about that thing. But there's also a little bit more that I want y'all to do. I want you to take 30 minutes to sit and address the following. Y'all know, as I said in episode 1, I am big on journaling because times where I can't find the words, where I don't have anybody to talk to, when I can't murmur a prayer, I pull out my journal and I let things flow for me freely. So if you have a journal, or even if you don't, I encourage you to get one. Or if you have a voice note in your phone and it works better for you to just speak these things into your voice note, do that, your voice memo, that type of thing. Do it there. But take 30 minutes to sit and address the following. Where is it in your life that you've experienced trauma? And which of the 3 types do you think you've experienced? So is it acute? Is it chronic, or is it complex? And if you forgot what those are, go back to the beginning of the video to get a reminder of what those different types of trauma looks like. And then number 2, ask yourself what effects have come from the trauma that you've experienced. What is showing up in your life that you see are those effects? The developmental issues, attachment, detachment, trust issues, emotional regulation, behavioral issues, how you think, learn, process, problem solve, your confidence in yourself, disassociation, and then even look up other effects that could come from it, because there may be other things out there that speak more to you. But ask yourself, what effects have come from the trauma I've experienced? So that's number 2. Number 3, how have you, or how do you respond in life based on those traumas that you've experienced? So remember, as I said, some of the trauma responses can be anxiety, depression, sadness, fear, self-blame, guilt, avoidance, a perpetuation of the trauma. How are you finding that you have responded to the trauma that you've experienced? That's number 3. Number 4, Do you know your triggers? I know we did not get into triggers a lot, but triggers are often things that remind us of the past trauma. So we may not be experiencing that trauma firsthand anymore, but you may be triggered by something that takes you back to that place. For example, for me, I told you all as a child, I didn't have a voice. I was told that children stay in children's place. And so even in my marriage today, I'm working through the trigger of feeling like I don't have a voice, or my husband isn't listening to me, or I'm unheard. When I feel that way, it triggers me and reminds me of being a kid and being told to stay in the kid's place, that I can't be right, um, that I don't have a voice, that type of thing. Another trigger for me is feeling like people are dismissive of my children because I felt abandoned and dismissed my entire life. So remember, a trigger is anything that reminds you of a trauma or part of a trauma that you've experienced. So number 4, do you know your triggers? What are your triggers? And then the last one, number 5, have you begun to explore ways to triumph over the trauma that you've experienced? Have you began to explore ways to triumph over the trauma you've experienced? We're going to get into, again, like I said before, the triggers and the triumphs, ways to triumph in upcoming episodes. But again, I'll walk you through these questions 1 through 5. Number 1, where have you experienced trauma in your own life? And which of the 3 would you say you've experienced? Number 2, what effects have come from the trauma you've experienced? Number 3, how have you and how do you respond in life based on the trauma you've experienced? Number 4, what are your triggers? And number 5, have you began to explore ways to triumph over the trauma you've experienced? I want you to write these things down or record them and keep them, like I said, for the upcoming episodes as we dig deeper into triumphs, triggers, and traumas. But I want to close with this quote. If we do not acknowledge our collective trauma, how can we ever heal from it? When we speak, when we share, we can change things, maybe even change the world. And this is quoted by Seth King. Changemakers, remember, we can't change what we won't confront. So let's change the game.